Quilt It, the long arm quilting show is brought to you by Handy Quilter, manufacturer of easy-to-use long arm quilting machines, designed by a quilter for quilters. YLI, you'll love it. Paintbrush Studio, inspirational fabrics.
Welcome to Quilt It, the long arm quilting show. I'm Jody Davis. The scariest words in quilting are quilt as desired. How do you choose a quilting design for a quilt? The quilting can make or break a quilt. Joining me today is Suzanne Michelle Hyland. Suzanne, you've quilted many a quilt, haven't you?
I have quilted a lot of quilts, and I have seen quilting that really doesn't do very much for the quilt, and I have seen quilting that just makes a quilt shine.
So how do you decide?
There's some questions that you can ask yourself because there's so many possibilities, and that's what's scary about those three words.
Yes.
You just don't know what direction to go. So if you ask yourself a few questions, you can funnel down, narrow down those choices, and then preview or audition the design so that you can be very confident in your decision.
Great, so you're going to give us kind of a roadmap for our thinking?
And we're going to show you lots of quilts, which is what we like to see as quilters anyway.
So what is the first question that you ask?
Well, there's a set of three questions I really ask myself to narrow down the choice between an overall edge-to-edge type quilting design or an interpretive design, and that is quilting that's applied to a very specific area on the quilt, like a block or sashing or a border. So the first question is, how will the quilt be used? If a toddler's going to drag it around, or maybe even worse, you're going to send it to a college dorm room, you're not going to invest a lot. You're not going to invest a lot of time in the quilting. This is my daughter's quilt. She made it when she was 10, and we just wanted to get it finished fairly quickly, and she's going to use it a lot, and so we needed to hold those three layers together. And this was a groovy board pattern that she could apply very quickly and feel like she had a sense of accomplishment to get the quilt done and finished.
That's it with kids. You want to get them through the projects so that they get that sense of accomplishment. Get something complete.
That's right.
That they can
That's
say,
right.
I made this.
Sometimes we want that too.
Oh, isn't it true? Oh.
Now this quilt is very intricate in the piecing, but I knew that it was also going to lay on the floor of a cabin, and so I chose not to put as much effort into this quilt.
Yes.
And so it's important to ask that question, how will the quilt be used? If it's an art quilt or a show quilt or it's an heirloom quilt that I want my grandchildren to fight over, of course I'm going to put a lot more effort into the quilting.
Yep, well that helps.
Well, this is a quilt where we would want to have a lot of detail.
Right, this is a whole different story.
It is a whole different story. I mean, you certainly wouldn't do an edge-to-edge type quilting pattern in this quilt.
People would look at it and say, why?
Exactly. Why did you go through all that effort for the piecing when you didn't do something to complement the quilting?
And you did many different designs of quilting within just this one.
I did. I looked again at the individual areas of the quilt, and this I would call interpretive quilting design.
Okay, interpretive meaning you chose different quilting designs for different parts depending on what that part is.
That's correct.
Like the center of the flowers to make it look like seeds or of the sunflowers?
That's right.
Yep.
So that the quilting complements and doesn't compete with the quilt.
What's another question you ask yourself?
Well, the next question is, are the fabrics similar in value? And value is colorblind. It's not what colors I see, it's whether I see light, darks, mediums, and different areas in the quilt where I can apply a quilting design. Now, this particular quilt, it's pretty similar in value.
Yes.
It's blue and green, but the quilting is going to show equally across the entire quilt, and so I chose to do an overall edge-to-edge type pattern. And the same with this quilt. This quilt also has very little change in light and dark. In fact, it's very similar in value, and so an overall edge-to-edge quilting type pattern works very well. And it has a variegated thread, so you pick up a little bit of the quilting that you might not see if we had used a thread that disappears into the quilt.
But the quilt doesn't call for any specific quilting in a certain area.
It doesn't really have a place where the quilting would show extremely well,
Yep.
and so that's why that quilting works for that quilt.
Yep, I've learned a lot already.
Well, let's look at the next quilts. Now that same question, are the fabrics similar in value? Are they on this quilt?
No.
They're not. There's light spaces and there's dark spaces. And quilting really shows best in light spaces.
Yes.
I could have taken this stencil and I could have applied it here and here to this log cabin.
It would be lost.
It would be lost because it's a dark fabric, and so because it shows the very best here, I wanted to highlight the quilting in this space. Now when we talk about interpretive quilting, you can see in this quilt, I'm looking at the spaces where the quilting is going to show the very best and showcasing the quilting in those areas.
So the straight line quilting in the red area accentuates the pretty quilting in the tan area.
That's right. Because it's so simple in the red, it really does make that lighter area shine. Okay, here's the next quilt, and you see It does have different areas that are light, medium, dark, but it's a very simple meander. All it really does is hold those 3 layers together.
Serves the purpose of quilting, the definition.
Well, it does, but that's pretty much all it does because there's no style or flair to it at all. Now look at this quilt. It's the same quilt, but it has intricate, interpretive quilting.
It's not the same quilt, Suzanne. It's not.
This is quilting makes the quilt, right?
Yeah, right.
But you can see that I've looked at individual spaces and put an element into those spaces where it doesn't cross from the dark into the light, and so you see the elements of the quilt.
Yeah.
Now, the third question is really important, and that is, are there fabrics in the quilt that are busy prints? So how much quilting do you see in the borders?
Not as much as in the white space.
That's right. And now look at the back. How much quilting do you see in the borders?
Oh my goodness.
Quite a bit of quilting. From the front, you don't see that much.
Right.
And the reason is this is a very busy print. You just cannot see it. And so had I done a simple line, maybe out to the edge, it would have simplified this pattern, and it really probably would have worked a little bit better. But I did want to illustrate, you may not want to knock yourself out against a busy print because you can't compete with it.
Yes, so you're not gaining anything.
You're not gaining anything.
Suzanne, once you've made the decision between an all-over quilting pattern versus the interpretive, what's the next thing that you think about?
Well, there's a few more questions I do want to ask myself to narrow down maybe the style of the quilting design that I'll choose and maybe where I'm going to put it on a quilt. So let's look at this quilt here.
Ooh, pretty.
What is the style of the quilt?
It's a log cabin. It's very traditional.
It's very traditional. So I think when I look at a quilt, is it traditional? Is it contemporary? Is it artistic? Is it playful? And then I'm going to look for motifs and designs that are going to be complementary to the quilt. The next question I ask myself is, are there places in the quilt where the quilting will shine? And we talked about that a little bit, where quilting really does show best in light spaces. In fact, if you look at a quilt from a distance, you will see white thread on white fabric where you will not see dark thread on dark fabric.
Oh, true.
It's very different.
True.
So look here, see this red area? Look at how much on the back, how much quilting there is in that red area, but you don't see it as much as this because this is light, this is dark.
Yep.
So there are places in a quilt, like a medallion quilt or an art quilt, where you might have a natural space for the quilting to show the very best, and I would gravitate towards those areas and really make the quilting shine in those areas.
So take advantage of those spotlight areas.
That's right. Another question is, you might look at the fabrics that are in your quilt and look for cues in the fabrics, such as flowers, swirls, waves. If you have an animal print, you might consider maybe a paw print in the quilting. So look at your fabrics for cues and then repeat those in the quilting design.
Yep, and people love to look for those. Those are so much fun.
Well, it's really a good art tip
Yep.
to repeat a design element that's already there.
It's a theme.
It's a theme. And that's the next question. Are there motifs or is there a theme to the quilt that you should follow? The blue and green quilt that we saw earlier, it reminded me of 2 oceans. And so naturally I thought about putting fish and waves and things on that. Or if you have a fall-colored quilt, what would you quilt on a fall-colored quilt?
Leaves.
Leaves, ferns, something like that. So we've talked about whether to do overall edge to edge, whether to do interpretive design, look at the style, and then I have one last tip for you. And that is that opposites create visual interest. And what I mean by that is if your piecing has a lot of straight lines, I want to add curves in the quilting to soften those straight lines. So if the quilt has straight lines, add curves.
Now what about when you have applique in a quilt?
Well, applique, I would do just the opposite. Applique already has a lot of curves in the piecing, and so there's one element that really shows off the curves very well, and that is cross-hatching. Those straight lines create contrast with the curved lines in the applique and really make the applique pop.
You know, when you look at quilts, and now with that knowledge in mind, it will really become clear, because I'm picturing it.
Yeah, you can look at quilts and you will see that that is very true. If your quilt has a lot of straight lines, add curves in the quilting. If it has a lot of curves in the piecing, add straight lines for quilting.
Suzanne, thank you. That was so much great information.
Oh, it's really fun to look at quilts and decide what to do with them, isn't it?
It is, yes. Suzanne will be back with more on quilting your quilt on Quilt It, the Long Arm Quilting Show.
We are the Handy Quilter Studio educators, and we want you to know why we love our Handy Quilter quilting machines.
Handy Quilter quilting machines are innovative, Check out the color touch screens, 2 kinds of stitch regulation, and computer-guided quilting.
Handy Quilter quilting machines are intuitive and easy to use, and they come in a size that fits your quilting style.
Handy Quilter offers training, service, and ongoing education. We care about your quilting experience.
Handy Quilter quilting machines are designed by a quilter for quilters. We'll be at a quilt shop near you or a show. Come give one a test drive. To learn more, call or click for a free demo DVD or
Follow the truck to Handy Quilter.
Welcome back to Quilt It. Suzanne Michelle Highland is here to tell us more about choosing designs for quilting patterns. And you have a wonderful way of giving a sneak peek so we can get an idea of what the pattern's going to look like and the thread on the quilt top.
That's right, because you think you might know what pattern you want to use, but how do you really know? Now, this is an example when I was a very novice quilter. I thought, you know, it's a tree quilt, I'm going to use a leaf design, but I really didn't know about placement. And so here, it looks okay here, but it really would have been more effective had I put it in this light space.
Right.
So if I had the opportunity to preview or audition where the quilting lines were going to fall on my quilt, I would have been able to make a better decision about the quilting.
You would have more information because you'd see it didn't work.
That's right, that's exactly right. So here's how to make it a little more fail-proof. And it's called Quilter's Preview Paper, and it's a clear plastic. And I draw on it with Sharpie marker because it dries very quickly and it's not going to smudge onto my quilt. And the Sharpie marker can be removed with a little bit of rubbing alcohol, so it is reusable.
You can reuse the paper.
Right, and we also placed a line along the edge so that you didn't write off onto your quilt with Sharpie. You need to know where your boundaries are when you're drawing or auditioning your designs. So this is a stencil, and Jody, tell me what you think is good or bad about this quilting design for this particular block.
Well, I think it's pretty how the hearts, where they fall and where these little loops fall. I think that looks really nice.
Right, and it doesn't quite fill up the whole block, and so I might have to echo out to the edge. Now, here's another really important thing when you're looking at your quilting design on your quilt first, and that is, what color thread would I use?
I don't know.
If this quilting changes from the white to the purple, to the white, to the green, and so if I use a white thread, it's going to disappear here, scream here, disappear here, scream here.
Right, but then you can't use like a beige because that wouldn't look so good. What would you use?
Well, I would probably use monofilament, and I'll show you a little bit more about that.
Okay.
So you want to see where the quilting path falls on those light and dark spaces in your quilt.
Aha.
Now here's another pattern. This is from a pattern pack. And by itself, it's a great quilting design, but
it does
what
nothing.
does it do for this quilt?
Nothing.
Nothing.
It doesn't speak to what the shapes are in there at all.
No, and it really competes with it.
It does.
You wouldn't know where to look. It doesn't do anything to complement the light, mediums, and dark spaces. Okay, here's another design.
Oh, it's a pretty design. That fits much better.
It does fit much better. And this, what I did was I looked at maybe some intersections of the seams, middles, and remember that if there's a lot of straight line in the piecing, what do?
We have quilt with curves.
Quilt with curves, that's right. And what's nice about this particular design, if I want to use white thread, do you see that the design stays within the white area?
Yes.
So I could use white here, I could use green here, or I could use monofilament thread. So previewing the thread path, I think, is just as important as looking at scale, appropriateness of the quilting design for the quilt, and whether it's going to complement or compete with it.
And the preview paper does all of that for you.
The preview paper does all of that for you. I don't know how to choose a quilting design without seeing it on the quilt first.
How can you?
I don't
You're
know.
guessing then.
I don't know. You're a whole lot more confident if you can see it before you quilt it.
Yes, we are visual.
That's right.
So threads really make a difference, Suzanne?
They do. Quilting design really impacts the quilt, but the thread color is so important. Now look at this quilt here. From the questions I asked you earlier, are the fabrics different in value? Well, this isn't, and so we would think about an overall design.
Right.
But how did I get away with interpretive design on this quilt?
I don't know. What did you do?
I used contrasting threads.
Oh.
Contrasting threads, not threads that scream, but at least show in all of the areas of the quilt.
So you can see the quilting
So I was
rather
able
than
to-
it melting in.
That's right. So I was able to break the rules on this quilt. Now let's look at this quilt, and it's got lots of light, mediums, and dark
Oh,
spaces.
so you should have done an interpretive pattern.
I would have thought about an interpretive pattern, but how did I get away with an overall edge to edge on this quilt?
Well, we don't see the thread.
You don't see the thread. It's monofilament.
Oh, it is.
It's clear thread.
Wow.
And so it doesn't change a whole lot from the medium to the lights. So let me show you a little bit more about that.
I'm learning so much about thread. I love this, Suzanne.
All right, here's a square, and I've made this square 4 times so that you can really see how thread impacts your decision. Light areas, dark areas, busy print, medium print. And I've used light color thread, and it really screams on the dark.
This just jumps right out.
It does, so much more than what you see on the light, and so you don't really see the whole design. And now look at this.
Oh, that's much better. You can see the quilting, but you can also see the fabrics.
You can see the fabrics. And what I love about monofilament thread is that you see the thread path because there's of the needle holes, but you don't see thread color.
Yeah, it doesn't jump out at you.
That's right. Now, most of the time when I'm teaching this, people will inevitably ask me, well, what about variegated threads? Let's look at the effect of variegated threads by doing some quilting.
Oh boy, we get to quilt! Yay! Well, it must be time to quilt because Suzanne has her zinger on.
Yes, I want to show you the effect of the thread on this square and how you might be able to even preview it further. Now, we're at a sit-down quilting machine. This actually is the same machine that can be on a frame.
Well, I noticed that's the HQ16, and I've seen that on those big frames.
That's right. You could add a carriage to this and put it on a frame, but for some of us who have a little bit less space, this is a great option because you still have a lot of room to quilt your quilt without having to be on a frame.
Way more than a home sewing machine.
Absolutely. Okay, let's look. This is one way that I can look at thread. I can just puddle it, pool it, maybe in the different areas of the block and see what it's going to do. But I really think the best way, if you're unsure, is to do a little test first.
The proof is in the pudding, or the quilting.
That's right. And I actually probably would even do this right on my quilt, and I'll show you why. Let's go sew.
On the quilt?
I would do this on the quilt.
She's got nerve.
You might wonder why, but you'll see here. Okay. When I quilt on a sit-down machine for an extended period of time, fabric takes oils out of my fingers, and so I lose grip. And so I'm going to use some gloves, Machine Girls quilting gloves. And they have some grip there at the ends. See those fingertips?
Yep.
All right. And I can set my speed on this machine because the difference between being on a frame you can have a stitch regulated mode, but when you're sitting down, you are the stitch regulator.
Right.
And so you can adjust the speed of the machine to where you're comfortable. Now what I want to do with this is I want to quilt across the different areas of this particular square.
So you can see how the thread looks.
Light, medium, and dark. That's right. And it doesn't matter what I quilt.
Well, it's a good time to practice.
It is. I'm just going to take some kind of a motif and move it in the different areas.
It looks pretty so far. Looks real good on the dark. Pops.
Okay, that's enough. Now, if this is really on my quilt, and I'm not going to use this quilting design, have I just sabotaged myself? I don't know. Let's take a look. So I've significantly loosened the top tension so this can be pulled out very easily. But let's look and evaluate what this thread might do to this quilt. It does have yellow and red and greens, which are in the quilt. But do you think it might be the best choice? Remember the squares that we saw before? We had light thread, medium thread, and monofilament and variegated. Let me even pull this. Let me show you this here. This is another variegated thread.
Yep.
It does have the light, the medium, the dark. I don't know if it's the best choice. My particular decision, I think it'd be monofilament. Because with variegated, you can't always control where the particular color is going to cross a particular fabric.
Here, it's dark here.
Right.
But it's the light over in the same color, but in another place. So yes, you can't control where it's going to end up.
I think it's all about value. And I think variegated works very well when you have a lot of the same value type fabrics across mediums, across all lights, across all darks. But when it shifts from a medium to a light, it doesn't show equally well. So great for some things, maybe not so much for a quilt that we're going to use a lot of interpretive quilting.
So now what are you going to do? Because this is your real quilt.
This is my real quilt.
Did you mess it up? Are you going to have to sit here and pick it out for ages?
I sure hope not. This is what I do, and this is why I loosen the top tension. If I just go to those intersections and clip the threads,
That whole piece is going to come up, isn't it? Yoo-hoo!
See how quickly that bobbin thread came out?
Yes.
And then I can pull those threads out quickly. But now I'm even more confident in my decision because I've seen it first.
Excellent.
So quilting design, thread choice, you've made the decision in advance, you've auditioned the quilting design, you've auditioned the thread, and you're ready to go.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne. I love that tip.
You're welcome.
Suzanne will be back with more information on choosing your quilting designs on Quilt It. In the meantime, check out one of our short takes on long arm quilting. This short take is all about backings, and joining me is Vicki Hoth, who's an educator with Handy Quilter. Vicki's made a lot of quilts in her time, so that means she's made a lot of backs, which kind of makes you an expert, would you say?
Kind of.
Now, Vicki, so many times our backings are like an afterthought. We just throw together some fabric, but it really makes a difference, doesn't it, when you plan your backing?
Well, yeah, you need to kind of decide, are you a confident quilter? And if you're a confident quilter, maybe you could put a plain, solid fabric on the back. But
To
if you're
show
not,
off your quilting.
that's right. But if you're not, then choose something that's busy.
Right.
So that
I don't even
maybe-
see the quilting here.
That's right. But it also complements the front. It matches the fabric.
Uh-huh.
But if you are a confident quilter, we have this really wonderful fabric. Choose some minky or some solid fabric
yes.
that it'll show on the back. So you kind of have two quilts there.
Oh, that's a great idea. This is a
fun?
cute design,
It
by the
is,
way.
isn't that
Perfect
fun?
for kids. Now, Vicki, what happens when your fabric isn't wide enough and you have to seam your fabric?
Well, you know there are fabrics that you can purchase that are wide enough.
Yeah.
But sometimes they don't match your quilt tops.
That's
okay?
right.
So if you have to seam, then, you know every fabric comes with a selvage?
Yes.
Cut it off.
Uh-huh.
See this one?
Yeah, and what it does, two things, doesn't it? I've found that it makes the seam pucker, and also it's so thick there.
Little ridge there.
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of people don't know that.
So this one, we've matched it up with our fabric. See how nice that matches with the fabric?
Oh, it does.
Okay. Then let's pull this out here, and you can see. Do you see how I seamed that an inch?
Oh, it's really wide.
But I clipped off about half of it
To get rid of those
to get rid of the
selvage.
selvage, and then press open that seam.
Okay,
All
solve the
right?
problem.
Solve that problem. Now, let me show you something else. What if you have a lot of fabric left over? So let's take the fabric from the quilt. We have the fabric here in the quilt, and you can see all this different fabric. And we have these fabrics left over. Make a quilt for the back.
Oh, piece
You know,
something.
Piece something.
Oh,
Then you've used up your fabric.
that's right.
So this one has been pieced from all the fabrics from the front.
That's much more interesting than just a plain piece of fabric.
That's right.
You've got two quilts in one
That's
almost.
right.
Great.
And then, looking at the back, the selvages are cut off, and then it's seamed, it's pressed open.
To make it lie flatter?
So, lie flatter, and doesn't add bulk as it stitches. If you're doing hand stitching or on a long arm quilting machine, you know, you want less bulk on that back seam.
Well, the less bulk, the better, always.
Always.
Well, I learned so much. Thank you, Vicki.
You're welcome.
For more information on backings, go to qnntv.com. You should choose the best thread for your quilt because you're making an heirloom that will last for years. YLI makes thread for every need. Choose YLI's Long Arm Pro Thread and YLI Machine Quilting Thread for your long arm quilting projects. Both are 40 weight and come in gorgeous solid and variegated colors. For a different look, try YLI Fine Metallic or YLI Silk 100 Thread in solid or variegated colors. Both perfect choices for long arm machines. YLI Thread, we designed it for you. Paintbrush Studios brings the high quality and experience of a 40-year-old fabric company and a friendly Midwestern attitude to your local quilt shop with our exclusive fabric lines. From the staple group of blenders to the exciting new collections introduced each season, Paintbrush Studios fabrics are created with the quilt maker in mind. Visit the Paintbrush Studios website to download the free pattern for Crystal Rainbow and create your own treasure. Welcome back to Quilt It. We're here with Suzanne, who has taught us all sorts of things to think about before you actually sit down to quilt that quilt. And now, Suzanne, you're going to put it all together for us.
We are. We're going to look at real quilts and come up with some real solutions.
Yay!
We have covered a lot of ground. We've asked ourselves some questions about whether we're going to do an overall edge-to-edge type quilting pattern or whether we're going to look at individual spaces and interpretive design. We've talked about style of quilt patterns and what you might want to use there. Well, this is the fun part. And I love to get together with quilters and have them bring their quilts, and then we look at them together, and it's almost like quilting by committee because you get to decide.
Yes, we do that with our bee, and I love it. You spread a quilt out and you talk about it, and everybody gets ideas.
That's right.
And we come up with something wonderful that you never come up with on your own.
And you can also, because you see so many different quilts, it starts to get you to think about maybe quilts you might be making in the future. So it's really a lot of fun.
Right. Well, it exercises your brain so that you learn more because you go through the thought processes.
That's right. And I'd rather work together than alone anyway.
Yes.
I feel a lot more confident.
That's what quilting's all about.
So I have some quilts here. We just taught a retreat, and some women were willing to let me keep their quilts so that we could look at them. This first quilt is called Take 5, that's the pattern. It was made by Deanna of Alden, New York. And let's go back through the questions. How will the quilt be used? She said it's a lap quilt.
Okay.
And so I would naturally lean towards an overall edge to edge.
Yes.
What about the values? Are they similar or different in value, the fabrics?
Well, they're similar.
They are. And the third question, is it a busy print?
Yep, I'd say so.
It's a little bit busy. So I traced out this design. This is a pantograph on the preview paper. And it really is going to complement this quilt well because it's kind of a busy, funky fabric, and so a busy, funky quilting design would really work well for this quilt.
All that motion would be nice.
A lot of motion. And as far as thread color, I think I might be going to lean towards that royal blue.
Oh, really?
You might look for a variegated that would work, as long as you could pick up the orange, the yellows, the purples, and the blue. I think it would be great.
Then that would lend some more funkiness to it being a funky quilt.
Yeah, I think a variegated thread would work really well. Okay, let's look at the next quilt. This is from the same quilter.
Very different.
Very different. This is called Day and Night. It's a pattern from Eleanor Burns. And what you see, at least what I see naturally, is that there's stars.
Yep.
And then there's also another element here, and that's this kind of circular pattern.
Yes, and there's a contrast in the colors, big contrast.
There is a big contrast in the colors. We've got kind of a medium color here and a very dark. However, I still think I want to look at an interpretive design, but I don't have, where's the space that the quilting is going to really show? What do you think?
Well, it would show either maybe around a motif.
Yes.
But it's going to show more in that orange.
I think it is going to show more in that orange. And so when we talk about thread color, I think I would lean towards maybe a smoke monofilament. And monofilament is generally clear, but there's also a color called smoke, which kind of blends better with darker fabrics.
Oh, good.
And here's why. I think I have an idea for this quilt. Let's pull the preview paper out.
Oh, good. We're starting from scratch.
We're starting from scratch, and I really like this. This is a process. Like when you write a term paper, you don't always get it right the first time. You might have to go back and rewrite. So think of this as a process so that you can be comfortable with your decision. I think that on this quilt, I really want to accentuate the star and this space here. And so first of all, I would ditch stitch this area here.
Outline the star.
Outline the star. And then to draw more attention to the star, I would split the middle right here. See how the piecing is here?
Yes.
But I would split a quilting line right here in between.
Oh, look how that just amplifies it.
It will. It'll really draw some attention. And then another here. This is a ditch stitching. And I'm going to kind of leave that middle alone for just a minute. Now let's look at this space. It's naturally a round space. And so there's two things that I could do. I could start in the middle and spiral out.
Oh, and accentuate that circular pattern or design to its shape that you really wouldn't see because it's so angular.
That's right. And remember we talked about two opposites create visual interest?
Yes,
and so you have the curves and you have the straight. Now I left this alone just for maybe a decision. Do you think that it might be better to do another straight line here? Or can we draw this element into here?
I love that. That is a great idea.
Either I could spiral here.
I like that.
See how that just brings these two together? Okay. So
I
Deanna
love
will be happy
I love
with that.
it. Yeah. Oh, that you figured it out for.
That's right. Yeah, that's what they enjoy the very most. This is a really fun quilt because it's got lots of different elements. It's a 2009 Golden Thimble Mystery Quilt. And so usually you're piecing it in different sections and the whole quilt doesn't come together until you see it. Well, because it's got so many different areas, we need to highlight those areas, but we also need a unifying background.
Right, otherwise it could just be, it wouldn't go together.
That's right,
Yeah.
it wouldn't go together. So Sue from Greeley, Colorado, let me use this quilt. I'm so glad that she did because we can really illustrate a lot of things here. Okay, so I roll out the preview paper. Okay, first of all, one rule I don't have a lot of rules, but this is a rule, and that is any applique needs to be outlined. And these are pieced in,
Yeah.
but if you don't outline them, and let's say you were to do this, let me illustrate over here, I think a stipple in the background would look really great.
And then it accentuates the words. Makes them
It
pop
does
out.
accentuate the words. If you don't ditch stitch, then the pattern here, what you're going to see is this awkward shape in between.
Ah,
So when you ditch stitch, you interrupt that shape and you really make the words show.
make that letter stand out as one letter rather than as the shapes.
That's right. So any applique, I try to do that.
Okay,
So
good.
stippling in the background. Now this stippling is going to be something I'm going to apply to the entire quilt. That's the unifying background.
That makes sense.
Okay, now let's look at maybe another couple of sections. Here's a star. Okay, same thing for me. I just think I would ditch stitch this. You won't see the ditch stitching, but it will define the star.
Yes.
Now, lots of straight lines, and so let's add some curves.
Pretty. And it accentuates that it's a star.
It
Accentuates the shape.
does. See that? That would be really great there.
Yep, and then with the stippling all behind, it'll be gorgeous.
Stippling all behind. Now, let's look at certainly going to stipple into here, but I think I'm going to stop my stipple here. This is a very dominant stripe in the middle of the quilt. And so I think it would be better, rather than trying to, for example, take the stippling into here, I think it would be better if we do this simply. And that is
Oh.
to just X through.
Then
See
it
that?
stays as a separate element from the rest of the quilt.
And if it weren't so dominant, I probably wouldn't be so worried about it. But I think because it's such a large part of the bottom portion of this quilt and it's repeated in other areas of the quilt, I think that that straight line quilting would be great.
Let it stand alone.
That's right. So unifying background, individual elements. Let's look at the border.
Okay.
Now, she has on this border, I think that this is too narrow of a border to worry about. And the other thing that this red here is actually dimensional. You can lift up this red. It's not pieced in.
Oh, it's folded in.
It's folded in. And so that's really difficult to quilt around, and so I don't think I would try. I think I would just leave it. Last, what about this border? Remember what we learned?
It's real busy. So the quilting, if you do a lot of quilting on it, it's wasted.
Right, so I don't really want to compete with it. So here's a way I can bring it in to still complement and be a part of the quilt. Do you notice that I had some spacing up here in this area of the quilt?
I see where you're going.
That I could come right down through to here and use that spacing to piano key this
keys.
border.
Yes.
Okay, if I didn't do that, because this is so close to this, let's say that I used, a random, I don't know, inch, I think that your eye would not, it just wouldn't be congruent. And so it's much better to complement these two areas rather than to try to have them be different shapes.
That's great. So you're taking your cue and bringing it out here.
That's how you bring a quilt together, especially a sampler quilt. Okay, let's look at the last quilt. This is a quilt made by Mary Bell of Winslow, Arizona, and she actually designed this quilt from a panel called La Belle's. And I think it's really neat how she fussy cut all of these different
Yes.
flowers and then showcased them in an Irish chain block. Let's take a look at what we might want to do here. Now this Irish chain is a really important element we don't want to ignore.
Right.
Because it's a very distinct diamond shape. The quilt is actually set square, but the Irish chain makes it look like it's on point.
Exactly. But we don't want to ignore what would be the applique in the center.
Right, right. So this is the fun part too about quilting is this is a square, this is a square, you see the square piecing, but watch what my quilted line can do. If I start here and I take a quilted line and I'm going to take it through just on the edges of all of those colorful blocks there.
Oh, you're accentuating the on-point look.
I'm accentuating the on-point look.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to do too is I want to unify this Irish chain. So I would do this on all sides It's going to create a diamond shape around each one of the flowers. But what do you think I should do in here?
Well, you don't want anything straight, I don't think.
I don't think so either. I think that it needs something. And so let's consider this. This is how she could do it actually in a continuous line. Watch me for just a minute.
Ah.
Now when she comes back,
So she'd do that all the way across?
all the way across the Irish chain.
Ah.
Well, watch what's going to happen. I think this is really fun.
It is, and it's leaves, which is like the rose.
It's leaves, and so remember we talked about style of quilting and motifs? Well, look at that. It still almost has a diagonal effect to it,
it does.
but you see an individual element in each one of those little squares. So it
Perfect.
works really well.
Perfect. What would you do around the rose then?
Well, I think that the roses need to be accentuated. And so definitely I would go and outline the rose, and I would certainly recommend that she do some thread painting in here, where she would go and choose which elements to really make pop. Veins in the leaves, for example. And then what about the background?
Something just kind of simple and all over pattern that's small?
Yeah, do you remember we talked about dark threads on dark fabrics? Is it going to
Yes.
show very much anyway?
No.
I wouldn't knock myself out. Maybe just a stipple. Now you might consider, if she's really ambitious, she might do something like a McTavishing, where you take you know, a lot of lines, but I don't know. As I look at it, I wonder if it might be too busy, and if the stippling is just a better way to go.
I think so.
I think so too. Let's talk about the borders quickly, because you do have borders. You've got to address those. Certainly I would ditch stitch this. And I was kind of debating, you know, should we maybe take the flower element, the leaf element, and put it out in
That's
here?
what I was thinking. Repeat it? Or is that too much?
I wonder if it might be too much. But here's a way to repeat it. Okay, let's look at this black border. I think that she needs to look at the borders and find a repeat where she can take a diamond shape like this, whatever that repeat may be, and of course hers is going to be very even, mine's just quickly drawn. But do you see how then that Irish chain element comes out into here?
Yes.
And if she wants to, if that's not enough quilting, then this is the place where she could repeat that flower.
I like that.
Then everything gets pulled together. You've taken an element that's in the quilting in the interior, and you've brought it out to the border. I think it's going to look great.
I do too. Well, Suzanne, this is a perfect example of quilting makes the quilt.
Doesn't it help to just ask yourself these basic questions? Then you take all those limitless possibilities and you narrow them into a little funnel, and then you look at them on the quilt and you feel really good about the decision that you've made before you start quilting your quilt.
Gosh, Suzanne, I couldn't have stated it any better. Thank you so much. This has been very, very helpful. You've given me huge confidence.
Thank you. It's been fun to be here.
For more information on everything you've seen on the show today, including Suzanne's products, go to QNNTV.com. We'll see you next time on Quilt It, the Long Arm Quilting Show. For information on how to sign up for this and future episodes, visit QNNTV.com.